This review is not intended for children. When it comes to the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, chances are most people are mainly familiar with it from either at least one or both of the live-action film adaptations it received. What is probably less known about it is the fact that the story is based on a book by Roald Dahl. Furthermore, that book in question had a sequel. A sequel which for many reasons hasn't received any sort of film adaptation. But with the up-and-coming prequel to the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I think it's time we take a look back at its very bizarre sequel, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. But before we get into it though, just to say, if you haven't already, I would really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button and turned on notifications so you can stay up to date with all the content released on this channel. You can find and follow me on Twitter at the links here, and if you enjoy the video, be sure to like and comment your thoughts on it below. Now, in regards to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, there are a lot of jokes made about certain aspects of the story and the quite dark undertones. For example, assuming Willy Wonka is in fact a serial killer, Grandpa Joe faking his ailment, and the possibility that characters died off screen. With the first book and all the movies, we can laugh off some of these notions as being exaggerated and very cynical takes on the story. However, when it comes to Great Glass Elevator, all of these aspects are very much true. And they are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the bizarre things that happen in this story. It's been several years since I last revisited these books, so I'll be interested in seeing just how much of this story went over my head. So, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator pretty much picks up directly where the previous book and the first film adaptation end up on. That being Mr. Wonka bringing back Charlie and Joe back to the bucket house in order to bring the rest of the family to the factory. This means the main cast of characters is pretty big, with not only Charlie, Mr. Wonka and Joe, but both of Charlie's parents and Charlie's three other grandparents. Charlie, much like most of the protagonists in Roald Dahl's books, doesn't really have much in the way of character and just acts as a window into this situation for the audience. Mr. Bucket, I don't even remember what he does in the story, he's just kind of there most of the time. And Grandpa George and Georgina don't really have much to do outside of just complaining, which means we focus on three characters in particular, that being Mr. Wonka, of course, Grandpa Joe, who, for all the cynical views on him and his behaviour in the first book and film, he does at least try to have some sort of redemption in this story, which is just as well because his wife, Grandma Josephine, is in fact the villain of this story. Which is quite a bizarre thing to say, but it's very much true, as she is constantly complaining and causing most of the bad events to occur in the story because she refuses to give the admittedly very crazy Wonka the benefit of the doubt despite the protests of Charlie and her husband. Compared to their more likeable film counterparts, Grandma Josephine, Grandpa George, and Grandma Georgina are pretty irritating in this story. And what sort of trouble does she cause? Well, the plan was, of course, to bring the family to the factory, but since she is very, very stubborn, she takes control of the elevator and causes it to shoot off into space. Yes, I'm not joking, the story goes into space. In fact, most of the story is set within the elevator itself, which makes sense because it would be kind of false advertising if the Great Glass Elevator didn't at least play a prominent role in the story. And just as well, this is a fantasy. Luckily, Mr. Wonka planned for this eventuality. As they shoot into space, they begin to lose oxygen. Thankfully, the elevator has a button for that. It seems to have a button for everything the plot demands. Instead of trying to get back down to Earth, they decide to explore space and come across none other than a top secret government set up space station. Also heading to the space station is a group of astronauts bringing guests to the space station. As it turns out, it's a hotel set up by the President of the United States himself, who is in fact a significant character in the story. The President is portrayed as a man-child who can't form any basic decisions without the help of his lifelong nanny. You can make your own jokes about that here. The astronauts spot the glass elevator full of pensioners and a well-renowned chocolate maker and are naturally confused. Of course, they jump to the perfectly logical conclusion that they're planning to blow up the space station. Our main cast of characters arrive on the space station and prepare to explore, but receive a radio signal from the rocket which asks to identify themselves. Now, Mr. Wonka, rather than resolving the situation and putting everything at ease, decides to mess with them, spouting utter nonsense, which causes the President and the astronauts to come to the conclusion that they are in fact an alien invasion from Mars and Venus. Of course, such concept would be absolutely ridiculous if it weren't for the fact that the space station had already been invaded by aliens, the infamous Venetius Canids, who are so confident that they're going to win that they take the time to spell out the word scram with their bodies. It's a really goofy but also kind of creepy concept, which is very common in Roald Dahl's work. While all our main characters manage to escape, the astronauts don't know what the situation is and decide to board the space station. Unaware of the Canids on board, most of them get eaten. Thankfully, some of them escape, but there are far less than when they started. And it's up to Mr. Wonka to actually help them escape. And this is what ends up redeeming the main cast in the eyes of the tertiary characters. Now, realistically speaking, this would be a good place to end the story. But no, as we're not even in the third act yet, as we finally return to the factory. Grandma Josephine continues to be unpleasant, so Mr. Wonka decides to offer a new lease of life by giving her his latest invention, Wonkavite, which is very much a candy that can slowly decrease the age of the person who eats it by a certain number of years. Of course, the grandparents jump at the chance at this, and we get to see one of Grandma Josephine's most horrible moments. Mrs. Bucket respectfully asks that she have a couple, since she has been taking care of her parents for several decades and would like the opportunity to at least have some of those years back. The incredibly selfish Josephine not only refuses, but eats so many of the Wonkavite pills that she ceases to exist, not taking into account that the number she eats was higher than her actual age. In any other Roald Dahl story, the character would have been forced to accept their punishment, but in this case, rather than forcing her to live a state of non-existence for several months until she pops back up, they decide to go rescue her. Fortunately for the other two grandparents, they only had enough to just turn them into toddlers. As we enter the climax of the story, we learn that Mr. Wonka has invented an alternative to the Wonkavite, that being something that ages the person who consumes it, which only raises the possibility that this could be used as a method of assassination, but that is something that is never brought up. Mr. Wonka brings Charlie to try and track down Josephine, and what happens is that I can only describe it as Wonka and Charlie go to purgatory and search for Grandma Josephine's soul. They eventually succeed and spray her with the reverse Wonkavite, so much so that she rapidly ages over 100 years. She's back, of course, but now the climax of the story involves the family trying to guess how old she is in order to get back to her normal age. I will give Grandma Josephine this: the experience does seem to change her and she becomes a lot more likeable while in this older state, but that is forgotten when she returns to normal. As everything seems to be calming down, they receive a letter from none other than the president himself, who wants to congratulate them in person and invites them to the White House. And we get the payoff to the whole was Grandpa Joe faking his ailment the whole time by having it be topped by all three of the other grandparents proving that they had the ability to walk the whole time. But after all they've been through, everybody just accepts the situation and decides to get ready to meet the president. And that is where the story ends. Now, originally this was going to receive a second sequel, Charlie and the White House, but due to personal tragedy in Roald Dahl's life, the book was never made. As a child, this was one of my favourite of Roald Dahl's stories that I would listen to or revisit, but as an adult I can definitely be more aware of how bizarre some of the concepts are and how much it doesn't really make much sense. Plus, Grandma Josephine's behaviour is a lot more frustrating now. It's an incredible fun read for younger audiences, but I can see why it hasn't received any form of adaptation. Now, Roald Dahl's books are well known for their surreal and sometimes dark undertones, but I think in this case it's a bit more overt and extreme from the outset, compared to some of his other books like Matilda, where it's a bit more grounded to begin with and the more supernatural or bizarre elements slowly start to be introduced throughout the story. I'm curious to hear from people who have read the book what their thoughts are on it, so let me know in the comments what you think of Great Glass Elevator and if you think it deserves more attention or deserves to be a more obscure piece. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.